So, over the past several lessons, we have been looking at how Europe coped with the fall of Rome and the kind of civilization that came up after it. Today, we're going to be thinking about what we should call this time period in European history. Is it a dark age? That's the most common way to refer to the time immediately after the fall of Rome. Can we call the entire post-classical period a dark age? And what is gained and what is lost by giving time periods titles anyway? To review, the Dark Ages in Europe, if we're going to use that term, describe the first few hundred years immediately after the fall of Rome. And if you guys remember, when the Roman Empire fell, all of its specialized knowledge, its infrastructure, its civilizational organization fell with it, and people were left sort of scrambling for how to survive. A couple of ways that they found to survive included relying on the feudal system to get people what they need, in which you had kings, and those kings had like a whole series of nobles who had castles and fiefs, if you want, like, big estates in the countryside. And using that land, they traded land for the services that they needed. So they'd give parts of their land to their knights to live on, and those knights had to protect them. And they'd give even smaller plots of the land for the peasants to use. Obviously, that land didn't belong to the peasants at any point, but they were allowed to live there and produce food for the entire estate. Obviously, though, if the peasants didn't produce enough food, you just have less peasants. The rich people didn't starve, peasants did. So that was the feudal system. It got people what they needed in terms of like a place to sleep and something to eat and some amount of protection. But it didn't leave any room really for social mobility. You can't have education or specialization in a society that just uses land as currency. There's no way to save money. There's no surplus. So that was part of the story. The other part of the story involves the Catholic Church, which was the only institution that remained capable of acting throughout Europe after the fall of Rome. The Catholic Church held a monopoly on what people believed. It was the place that directed Christian faith. So for people who were in a very, very hard time, whose lives were very difficult, it provided them a source of hope, that Christian faith, that maybe in the next life in heaven, they'll live better than they do now. It provided legitimacy and, some sort of justification for the feudal system with the king on top. The Pope said the king had the right to be king, and because everybody was Christian, that worked. And it also enforced its belief through some less than wholesome practices, as we saw in our last lesson, including torture. And it was really intolerant of anybody who didn't follow what the Catholic Church taught. So this is a huge contrast from the other major civilization that we've learned about, the Arabic civilization. And because of this sort of relative intolerance, because of the low standard of living, the violence, just general rough times, people tend to call this period a dark age. That's not the only reason, but that is one of the reasons that the title has stuck. Let's take a broader look, though, at when exactly we're looking at. On the timeline, you'll see the classical period. That's back when we looked at ancient Greece and ancient Rome and the Roman Empire when it was at its height. After the classical period, after the fall of those classical empires, we have the post-classical period, also called the medieval period, also called the Middle Ages. And if you look at the timeline, you'll notice that that's about 1,000 years of history. And 1,000 years is a really, 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 really long time to summarize in a word or in a title, right? It's certainly a really long time to call a dark age for one region of the world. So keep that length of time in mind. Following the medieval period, we get what's called the Renaissance, which in French means the rebirth. It's when Europe rediscovers, largely through contact with the Arabic civilizations, its classical ideas and philosophies, and kind of pulls itself out of a rut and experiences a golden age, so-called. So that's the big broad stroke. In order to understand why the Dark Ages are called the Dark Ages in so many ways, it's really useful to keep an eye on all of the effects of the fall of Rome and how they set up Europe to have a really rough time. After the barbarian tribes sacked Rome in 476 CE, in Western Europe, the Roman Empire collapsed entirely. So there was no one central government left to organize or direct Western Europe. Instead, you had decentralization. So lots of independent kingdoms with kings who went to war with each other from time to time. There was no big, strong military to protect that entire region anymore. So people ran away from cities because they're unsafe, and they moved to the countryside. Also, people didn't travel far from home anymore because it wasn't safe. And over time, that led to a general cultural fear and intolerance of outsiders. And intolerance increases. In this context, the Catholic Church and the Pope became very, very powerful. Similarly, Europe became a really violent and really unsafe place, especially relative to the way it had been under the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which also leads to fear of outsiders and intolerance. And it became mostly a rural place. That means most people lived in the countryside. Because there was no central government left to direct, taxes and everything else in Europe, there was no more system of coinage or currency, like actual, not paper, coin money. And so, like we talked about just a second ago, Europe reverted to a land-based economy where people trade, bits of land for the services that they need. This meant that there was no tax base. You can't really tax people in mass when there's not a system of money flowing, which meant that there were low levels of specialization and education. In order to have an educated society, you have to have enough money to afford for people to focus just on education and not on producing food, right? And this was not the case. This meant that overall standard of living went down. People no longer knew how to read and write, except for people who worked for the Catholic Church who had to because they had to interpret the Holy Book, the Bible. And generally, standards of living went down. You had the situation where people were living literally in the shadows of, Roman architectural achievements like the Colosseum and the aqueducts, and they had no idea how they built them. The government was not able to maintain roads or infrastructure on a large level like Rome had. And so long distance trade also stopped. Nobody's going to go traipsing through Europe, this violent and intolerant place, with, goods to trade that are worth a lot of money. They'd get robbed. Plus, the roads weren't great. So it's really hard to take a wagon full of stuff through muddy, land that's not paved. Roads turn out to be more important than you'd think. Anyway, long distance trade stopped, and cultural diffusion, or the exchange of ideas into Europe from faraway lands, stopped with it. You'll note that this leads to a pretty clear decline in the standard of living for Western Europe. Eastern Europe is a different story. It survives as the Byzantine Empire, a story for another day. Focusing on the West, things were pretty rough after Rome fell. Hence, the Dark Ages, right? On the screen, you'll find a few memes that some of my lovely students have pulled out throughout the unit to kind of describe the time. Europe was in rough shape. People who didn't fall in line with the Catholic Church or who were perceived as threats were tortured during the Inquisition. Things were violent, things were rough. And because of this intolerance, because there were no safe roads, because there was no long distance trade, and because there was a land-based economy and therefore no social mobility, this time period is thought of as being pretty bleak, hence the Dark Ages. However, we're talking about, like I said a minute ago, 1,000 years of history, and a lot can change in 1,000 years. Stop for a second here and think about 1,000 years ago. What was happening 1,000 years ago? Well, this stuff. Things have changed since then, right? So it's never a good idea to summarize a whole huge chunk of history with a really judgy, kind of value-laden term like the Dark Ages. So let's complicate it a little bit. Periodization is the word for how historians think of different time periods by theme. And you can really boil down this, big 1,000-year period of history into three different chunks. The first part, the early Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages, was mostly about surviving this big transition from the Roman Empire to, the void that existed after it, from the 400s to the late 900s. In this time period, you had demographic, cultural, and economic deterioration. That means the standards of living and the population kind of tanked. The Germanic tribes that had been sacking Rome began to settle in different parts of Western Europe, and the Catholic Church began a big campaign of Christianizing these Germanic tribes. So, getting rid of paganism, replacing it with Christianity to make sure the Catholic Church was powerful in all these different places. This succeeded, but it took a while, right? And in the meantime, you had, different pagan tribes fighting each other, Viking raids, things are terrible, etc. From like the late 900s, give or take, to like roughly 1200-ish, you have what's called the High Middle Ages, the Middle Ages, if you want. And this is when the feudal system really like became defined as the structure that governed the time period. The population began to recover, and as much as 90% of the population worked as rural peasants. So like the very bottom of the hierarchy, right? Castles were built, first in wood, later in stone, in response to the disorder of the time, because it's useful to have, big strong walls to protect you from all the violence. And these estates, these fiefs became hereditary, which means that like the estate was passed down from family to oldest son, generally. Also, a series of wars towards the end of this time period called the Crusades started. We're going to be looking at the Crusades in more detail next time, but generally, they were a series of holy wars. There's air quotations around holy that you can't see me making, launched by the Pope to take Jerusalem and what the Pope considered to be Christian holy lands away from the people who were living there at the time, Arab civilization. These series of wars were not successful, but they had some pretty huge effects on Europe that would eventually pull Europe out of this time period of like terribleness, which I'll get to in a sec. All right, so the final chunk of the Middle Ages takes us from the Crusades and the Plague to the discovery of the New World. And again, there are air quotes that you can't see around the word discovery because people were living there, but whatever. So there was plague, a series of epidemic diseases that wiped out the population. So the population tanked, but survivors enjoyed better material conditions, and that's going to eventually help bring us out of this time period. The Crusades also were ongoing. They all failed, like I said, but they had huge unintended effects for Europeans. First, by calling wars way over in like modern day Israel, Palestine, so like not in Europe. The Pope actually made a series of changes for Europe without meaning to. First, lots of violent people left Europe to go fight these wars, which made Europe kind of a more peaceful place for a little while, long enough to kind of recover a little bit. Second, this was the first time Europeans had traveled far from their homes in living memory. And when they did, they interacted with a civilization that was much more advanced than they were, the Arab civilization, which we learned about in the previous unit. This opened their eyes to all of the goods and technologies and, different knowledges that Islamic civilization had been benefiting from like the Indian Ocean trade. And it sparked a revival of interest in long-distance trade for Europeans. In doing this, in getting Europeans to like move, encounter new people, and aside from killing them, learn a little bit in the process. It sparked the revival of trade in Europe, and with trade comes cities and currency, a money economy. And with all of that, you have the makings of a more specialized population. You have a larger tax base, and standards of living can improve. So, aside from all the terribleness of famine and holy wars and plague, in the long term, the effects of all this stuff set the stage for European recovery to enjoy, another quote unquote golden age, not golden for everybody, but better, under the Renaissance. And this brings us to our notes for the day. So, can we call post-classical Europe a dark age? Or to what extent can we call post-classical Europe a dark age? And what are the benefits and dangers of doing this? Okay, so first, a very real decline in quality of life and apparent cultural decay experienced after the fall of Rome, plus, importantly, a general lack of written historical sources for the first few hundred years after the fall of Rome, have led some historians, controversially, to call this period in history a dark age. The lack of written historical sources is part of the decline story too, right? Because if you're just trying to survive, it's hard to, teach a whole population to read and get them to write sources that historians can learn from. So the time period is dark to us historians. And that's why, initially, this time period was called the Dark Age, because we can't see into it from the present. We don't really know a lot about it. It's dark. But you have to be careful when using this term for a number of reasons. One, it's judgy. Two, it doesn't apply to the whole world. It only applies to Western Europe, and not even the whole time, just the first few hundred years after the fall of Rome. And it can hide positive aspects of post-classical European life. So, why dark? In order to understand why this is dark, we have to do a little compare and contrast with life under the Roman Empire and what existed after in feudal Europe. Under the Roman Empire, we had a strong centralized government with bureaucrats who could collect taxes on a large scale. This meant that the centralized Roman Empire was strong and organized enough to collect taxes throughout that whole region. In order to do this, you need bureaucrats who had been educated to perform their jobs. To collect taxes, you need to be able to count and read, right? And the government paid for that advanced education. So you had an upper class, an elite that was literate, could read and write. Also, taxes provide the money to pay for this specialization. That's part of the story. Under the Roman Empire, this taxation was used in part to fund and maintain infrastructure like roads, aqueducts, big engineering projects to make life better for people, and to pay for a professional army to keep order. People who were loyal, in theory, to the Roman state, not to individual rich Romans. After the fall of Rome, we have a very different story. Instead of one strong centralized government, we have lots of weaker kingdoms, which made a more violent, less safe place. Instead of having a money economy, Europe had a land-based economy, feudalism. And this led to a rigid social hierarchy, where you couldn't really move up in class. It also meant a way smaller tax base. And so the kings, instead of being able to pay for their own stuff, relied on local lords and their semi-professional fighting force in knights for protection. So, no money to maintain infrastructure, advanced education, or specialization, and advanced literacy was found mostly in the Catholic Church. If you didn't work for the church, odds were really low that you could read and write. Even kings didn't much interest themselves in learning how to read and write, pretty famously. So you get the situation where there's an unsafe place, no long distance trade because it's unsafe and because the roads are terrible. So you get even less money coming in. In terms of sourcing, there's a pretty big difference between Roman Empire and after. Under the Roman Empire, we had a literate society, and there are so many primary sources that we're still wading through from the time period. After Rome fell, We had an illiterate society. People couldn't read and write except for the church. So you have very few primary sources. Lots of Bibles, though. And the time period is dark to historians. Third, there's this piece about the professional army that bears repeating. Under the Roman Empire, the strong centralized state's power was maintained through a professional army. That meant that the state paid the salary of people whose entire job it was to be good at being soldiers. After the fall of Rome, things are different. Power flows through the Catholic Church, and their power depends on belief and faith. They defend that power with violence. So, like, you get things like the Inquisition and torture. When people don't follow the teachings of the Catholic faith, they pay for it and it hurts. You also have a situation where instead of one army that's loyal to one state, you have, lots of different lords and kings who have different levels of loyalty in their personal knights who aren't a professional army. They're, violent and stuff, and they have swords and weapons, but they're not anything like what existed under Rome. And so, like, with lots of different little power bases, you have the makings of lots of conflicts and wars and violence. So anyway, that's why it's called dark. Always useful to be careful when applying a name like that to a whole time period for so many reasons, but mostly what you call something usually affects how you see it. And that's true in history as it is in life. If you, start taking history class and you're like, oh, history classes generally suck, this is going to be so boring, you're probably going to be bored in history classes because you've primed yourself to be. You've told yourself, like, through naming it a boring class, it's totally not boring, that that's like mainly what you're going to see. It's true for historical time periods too. If you call something a dark age, you're mostly going to probably focus on the bad things about it. And that means you might not notice anything good, which isn't the most objective way to look at time or history or anything like that. So this concludes our tour through a dark age. Probably not wise to call the entire post-classical period a dark age. I personally think that, like, the first several hundred years, the title fits, both because it's dark to us historians, we don't know much about it, and because I have a hard time finding anything good about, like, violence and institutionalized religious torture. But that is a controversial opinion, and you'll definitely find others who disagree with me. So today in class, you guys are going to be thinking about what you would call this time period, and ideally, what you would call the time period that we're all living through, the age of COVID. Like, if you had to name this year, what would you name it and why?